So under the Startup India program, we run various programs for the development of entrepreneurship ecosystem in the country. So for benefit of startups, entrepreneurs, innovators, we run programs such as 2-year incubation programs, which are typically for early stage startups at ideation phase. We run acceleration programs ranging from 3 to 4 months for prototyping and MVP stage startups. And these are typically on a specific technology domain. We also organize various events and boot camps in the institution in the region. We run startup programs in partnership with government agencies such as Engineers India Limited. And TIDES is also a nodal agency for Uttarakhand government for processing their startup applications. So startups, entrepreneurs, they can approach us. We'll be glad to help them in mentoring, legal, intellectual property rights protection, access to various world-class IIT Roorkee labs, as well as connecting to professors, alumni of IIT Roorkee, industry experts, investors, and also importantly, we also seed fund startups. So this is a brief about TIDES. And also, I also introduce Anurag to all of you. Anurag is an entrepreneur, a consultant in emerging technologies such as AI, blockchain, IoT, and a regular keynote speaker at global technology conferences. He has over 18 years of experience, has led various global organizations, and has lived and worked in various countries. Presently, he is the co-founder and CEO of Prima Felicitas LLC, a leading blockchain consultancy and an end-to-end blockchain technology solutions provider. It is based in San Francisco, London, and New Delhi. Prima Felicitas is focused on developing innovative blockchain products for government, enterprises, and startups in the fintech, energy, securities, healthcare, real estate, payment settlement, and gaming sectors. And Anurag is an engineering graduate from the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee, and holds a master's in business from the Stanford University. So welcome, Anurag.
Thank you, Manish, for that warm introduction. And hi to all. And as I said, it would have been a pleasure if the times were different and we were having this chat, on campus instead of this format. But pleasure to have you here anyway. Okay, so we're going to talk about the impact of blockchain on a variety of industries. And the idea here is to sort of give you a flavor of what's happening with this technology, how industries, industry bodies, different sectors are looking to either experiment or adapt to this technology. With that, I also would like to understand, I don't know if we can have a quick show of hands or poll here. I don't know if there's a way for doing that. Maybe Manish.
So yeah, people can raise their hands.
Okay.
So in the chat box.
Okay. So what I'm trying to understand is how many of you basically understand blockchain to the extent that you know what is a public blockchain ecosystem, what is a private blockchain ecosystem?
So to be honest, Anurag, we'll just keep people on mute mode, and to answer your query, like we have a mixed bag of people who are attending this session. So there are students who are currently in their undergrad, in their masters and in their PhD. We have people who are like running their own company and are entrepreneurs, and we have also a certain class of people who want to work on their idea in blockchain. So it's a mixed bag.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's good to know. So because there are a couple of variations to this presentation which I give. One is primarily focused on actually getting into the nuts and bolts of the technology and trying to sort of build ground up, right from the block stage to actually a hybrid network to a consortia or to a private, enterprise application. So that is not what we're going to be talking about here today. But at the end of the presentation, I leave my details. So happy to take on phone calls or emails if you have any further questions on this, right? So just sort of letting you know. So what we're going to talk about primarily today is more in terms of a common understanding of what blockchain is, and then building on top as to how people, businesses, organizations, governments are trying to look at blockchain and trying to harness it, right? That's the intent today. So what we're going to be talking about is first the context of the blockchain itself, and then the use cases, and finally, how do you decide on a use case? Right. So just to give you a context, again, these are like random things which are picked up from the internet. Anybody can just Google and you'll find stuff like that. Right. So this news clipping is about a consortia between some of the largest car manufacturers, where they are looking to use blockchain to trace, parts of, vehicle. So if you are in the automobile market where there is a secondary market and goods move through that channel, there's a lot of counterfeit. So to address that, this is a consortia. Bex 360 Degree is an organic coffee tracking application which sort of certifies that the coffee is organic. You can see right through the genesis of the beans. Walmart is working in a very big way, of course, teaming up with the IBM in terms of providing food security. So what happens in stores, I mean, not so much here in India, but, few locations in the US, what they're trying to do is they produce products on the shelf, and there's an app. So you just go and scan the QR on the product through your app. And as soon as you scan it, you can see the entire history, the entire trail of that food product's journey, right from the farm, as they say, farm to fork, right? So right from the farm to the time you consume it, you have complete visibility of the journey of that product, right? So you are sure that this is not, somebody has not really contaminated or changed or done something with the food. Patient data, this is a very big area in the US and of course in Europe as well, where they're looking at the healthcare data. And their systems obviously are in certain sense better, but then again, challenges, data resides in a lot of different silos and different systems, and for a variety of regulations and compliance reasons, this data is not allowed to talk to each other seamlessly, and it's a pain. So physicians, surgeons, doctors, they spend a lot of time in terms of documenting the history of interaction with the patient, and they really methodically sort of put everything on their, notes. And it takes a lot of time, which time obviously is taken away from seeing more patients, right? So that is one challenge that is there. And then, in terms of drugs is a very big area where there's a lot of counterfeiting, especially if I talk about developing countries, third world countries. And how do you address that? Again, with blockchain, you are able to trace right from the batch in which the chemical is charged, and you're basically preparing stuff, to the bulk drugs, to basically the time you're shipping it out, right? So everything is tracked. And you can then make sure that, okay, what drug you're getting obviously has the right components. So this is just to give you a flavor across industries. Blockchain obviously is being used across, I mean, at this point, I can't think of a single industry where they're not thinking of experimenting with it, right? Let's look at the context. And again, I think Manish was telling me that, we will have time at the end, about 15 odd minutes for questions, but,
Yes.
happy to sort of, if there is any pressing question you have, you can type in, and I think Manish can let me know, and I'm happy
Yes,
to
yes,
answer
sure.
that, right?
Yeah.
So here, I'm just trying to give you a comparison, see the industry for the artificial intelligence market, right? Projected to be about 190 billion by 2025. And here we are 175 billion. And we all know how old this industry is, how long it took to get to where it is now. And obviously it is maturing. I would say blockchain is not even at that point where it is mature to the level of artificial intelligence, but the kind of use cases that have come up in the short period of time of less than 10 years, actually 5-6 years since the time Ethereum came to the market, that's when it opened up for use cases beyond Bitcoin. So 2014 onwards, so within 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of work which has been going on, and obviously because of a couple of reasons there. So what we are talking about are a couple of things here. One is the public blockchain ecosystem, which is, let's say, Bitcoin, Ethereums of the world. And then you have the private network, which is where a lot of enterprises are going in. And so the presentation today would focus a lot on the public side of on the private side of thing, on the enterprise side of thing. But just to give you a context, I will also touch base on the public blockchain network. So public blockchain network, of which Bitcoin is one example. So this is something which is by design transparent. So what that means is all transactions are broadcasted, and you can basically go and look up online as to what is the transaction happened from a specific wallet address to the other wallet address. Now, the assumption is outside the ecosystem that transactions on Bitcoin are anonymous, but that's not the case. They are pseudo-anonymous, and there are ways by which you could actually identify the actors up to an accuracy of 70%. And there are companies which work very closely with regulatory bodies, helping them track down on anti-money laundering and all of that, right? So it is transparent and it is pseudo-anonymous, right? So that is the first property. Second property, as you all probably know about, is mining. So mining is an idea which comes from public blockchain. And mining is nothing but you are basically approving transactions, and in return, if your transactions get committed to the blockchain, you get certain rewards, right? But the crux here is anybody who is a member of the network has to actually contribute to the verification process, right? So what that means is the more nodes there are, the more participation there is in terms of securing the networks, because every node has to then go and approve it. But the challenge is more nodes mean more secure, but it is harder to scale, right? And so that is where some of the current issues, at least in the Bitcoin ecosystem, about scaling are there, right? Today, a transaction can take up to 10 minutes to get approved on a Bitcoin network. And basically it takes up to 60 minutes, to be honest, because you have to wait for at least 6 blocks to get approved before you can be sure that your transaction was actually approved. So there is an element of probability out there as well. But the challenge here is that it's more difficult to scale, because the speed is such and the way the architecture is there, you have difficulties in scaling, right? And every time you see there's a significant increase in the transaction speed, in different protocols, for instance, Hyperledger or some of the other ones, there is a degree of centralization, right? Because with centralization, you can do the same approval in less number of nodes, right? And so if that happens, then you save a lot of time, but then you're compromising on security in certain sense, right? So while you're designing these solutions and you're architecting them, you have to be mindful as to what level of centralization you want, what level of speed you want. And again, if it is an entity where all the actors are known, maybe you can do a little bit of centralization, because obviously you will be verifying. But if it's an open network, then you basically cannot centralize, you have to decentralize. So that is a philosophical difference there. And finally, time to finality is probable. And this is the point I was making earlier, is that while Bitcoin network says you have to wait for 10 minutes for your transaction to get approved, but in actual sense, you have to basically wait till 6 blocks before you can say with certainty that, yes, your transaction is now part of the network. And the reason this happens is because there are multiple side chains which continue to evolve, which probably get approved. But then at a certain point in time, which in the case of Bitcoin today stands at 6 blocks, is then the network has to decide which is the longest chain. And so the moment it decides one of them is the longest chain, and so the branch has to then again follow from the network, go to the unconfirmed transaction pool, and then get again approved, right? So that is why this finality is not there. Now think of all these issues from a business perspective. So let's get to the next slide. At the highest level, I mean, before I talk about what was there in the previous slide, let me just talk about the slide here. The first is public blockchain can provide visibility to competitors, which means the activities of businesses, how they are, shipping products, what is their price, what region they are giving, what sorts of discount, to whom they are giving. So all this information is out there in the public, right? The business logic and the business activities. This is clearly something which business wouldn't appreciate, right? And so what happens is you have then private blockchain, right? And so within private or enterprise blockchain, there are private smart contracts, which are between certain parties, which are not really open to all. And then participants, of course, are trusted participants, which means people have to first get themselves approved through a network. And there are certain criteria. Once that happens, then only you become a part of the network, right? So this is an aspect which plays very heavily when people are looking at a public or a private. And then trying to address what I was talking about in the first slide, enterprises have certain mandate and certain responsibility. The one of them obviously is to preserve privacy. Of course, the time and again we hear about the breaches, but then legally they are supposed to manage, and therefore there are laws like GDPR, data laws here and there. Like every country has a certain amount of data protection. So that liability is with the company, and so they cannot have something which is completely transparent and open, right? And secondly, security is another big aspect. So they have to make sure people who are on the network are basically compliant and follow certain regulations, right? Because otherwise the company becomes liable. Transaction throughput is a big challenge, right? If only a blog gets approved in 10 minutes, then it's a problem. I mean, imagine a case where you're trying to get a cup of coffee, you're standing in the queue, and then you're waiting for 10 minutes, or if it is Bitcoin, could be up to 60 minutes to get a coffee. That's not a good consumer experience. But if you were trying to do that between, let's say, Mexico, Colombia to Nigeria, you're trying to send $100, and if you can do that in 60 minutes, then that's a great outcome, because otherwise you could be taking 7 days, and to ship $100, maybe you're paying $40-50, right? So if that is the case, then it's a good outcome. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's all use case dependent, right? What level of centrality, what kind of use case, and that is how you choose a specific way forward. So transaction throughput for organizations is very critical. They want a certain amount of speed. Obviously they don't want super high speed in certain cases, because that is just not the need, because there are certain road blocks down the line which they have to address. But for sure they need it better than the Bitcoin network. And then transaction finality, the fact that you have to wait for 60 minutes to know that your transaction has not been approved, that is not an outcome any business would like to have, right? So therefore, this again rules out the public network. And the public network, depending on the load, the operational cost goes up. So every time you submit a transaction to get approved on a public network, you have to pay a certain transaction fees. Let's say in Ethereum, you pay certain gas, certain ethers, right, to basically get your transaction approved. Now, the challenge with this system is when there is more load on the network, the price goes up, because these are individual miners who have to be incented to basically go and approve certain transactions. So they would by default go and approve those transactions where the transaction fees is high. And so when there's a lot of load on the network, then transaction cost starts to creep up, right? Again, this is something which a business wouldn't want. So because businesses run their forecast for a year, cost projections, revenue projections, all sorts of things they factor in. And if suddenly, these things come in, your operational cost just goes haywire, this is not an outcome they are looking for. So for all these reasons, public blockchain is not a good use case within businesses. So that is where enterprises or private blockchains are more being used. Now, let's quickly look at the last bit before we get into the use cases. So let's think of the adoption trajectory, right? So think of certain historical trends over the last, let's say, 30 odd years. So the dot-com era, the people who benefited most were all these large corporations who were able to afford the infrastructure, the intranet, and all of that to basically harness the true potential at that point, right? And so all the companies in and around that time were basically large enterprises who benefited the most. Of course, there were startups which, obviously went on to become mega successful companies, but primarily it was the Ciscos of the world, or people of the sorts who benefited immensely during that time, right? Fast forward to the cloud era, again, enterprises were seeing a little bit lag, and then eventually, you look at Microsoft, the turnaround story. I mean, it is all hinging on what they did with the cloud to the enterprises, right? So again, the moment enterprises realized the value of cloud, they were the ones who were basically pioneering at the forefront, right? And the same trend is right now with private blockchain. So the private blockchain is where a lot of these use cases I'm seeing are moving towards. Right? They started with public, and they realized the challenges with the model to scale or interoperate, and that's where they realized true value would be in more of a private network. And there is a fine line in terms of how you architect it, because the way the centralized systems are set up and the way private blockchain is set up, there are few philosophical differences and which organizations need to address and follow very properly, because there are external elements also involved. But if they're able to do that, then it's a good use case. Otherwise, it becomes another centralized application development, right? And as I was saying, most use cases are in the enterprise space. That is where a lot of money is getting invested. That is where I see a lot of startups actually in the process where they are at a point that they start collaborating with bigger enterprises, banks, financial institutions, insurance organizations. I know so many of these people who are working very closely with blockchain-based startups. So let's talk about a few use cases here, right? The market is split like this, right? Use cases are fairly split, like, financial and non-financial. And the reason financial and non-financial is because financial is really big, right? And banks of, the smallest denomination, I would say, at least in the US, Europe, there's not a single bank which is not, trying to experiment with it, right? And of course, within the country, the major leading banks here, obviously, the banking segment is not so fragmented as the US, right? So here there are large banks only. There are very few smaller banks. So again, most of these banks I know have been, trying to work closely with Ripple or Corda. These are like basically protocols. And so ICICI Bank, SBI, HDFC, I know all of these banks are basically trying it out, right? So and the use cases are primarily, if you look at the the way it's split up, right? One is live in production, then pilots, then exploration, and then limited activity, right? And again, these charts are maybe they keep changing very, very rapidly. So you need to follow the space very carefully, because things are happening quite a lot at a very rapid pace, right? So at this point, payments and settlement is a very big area. If I talk about the financial services sector, and I'm going to talk about this use case, then trade finance is another one. Then wallets, KYC again. These three are prime areas. So obviously, these are coming from the financial services perspective, and obviously, a lot of big guys like IBM of the world are obviously trying to do stuff. But this is, I would say, a lot of greenfield space, right? Because the industry is very huge, right? If you look at the global shipping and transportation industry, it's massive, right? So if you look at that space and the kind of work that's happening compared to that, I think this is a very good area for people to get involved in. Identity, we worked on one project which was including biometrics, facial recognition, and then on the blockchain. Again, identity is a very big area. And then this whole supply chain area of track and trace, provenance tracking, right? So working on two different projects at this point in this area. So for the purposes of looking at where a lot of action is happening, I would say these are the areas where a lot of action is happening. But then, health record is a very big area where, even though it's exploration, US government bodies, government institutions, they're putting in a lot of money in this, right? Clinical trials is sort of starting, but this is a very big area. Compliance, we are working with KPMG on one project to do something on this. So, I mean, in nutshell, this is how you can think of the ecosystem. Obviously, there are a lot of other areas where work is happening, but at a higher level, this is how it can be seen. Let's look at a use case of how we can think of. So imagine this is maybe Samsung's factory here in Noida, and they have to ship it to one of the retail stores like Reliance Retail, one of their stores somewhere in Delhi, right? So interstate, or it could be even within state. So within Noida, let's say somebody has to ship. This should be a very straightforward process. I mean, in terms of the vehicle movement, it's very straightforward. You have a set of mobiles tagged, and then that's it. You reach this destination. But then there are a few other actors involved, and these actors are obviously having their different set of ledgers, different set of information. So what happens is everybody has to update their copy of ledger and have to have the new version of truth, right? And so what happens is every time an activity happens, they have to go and record it here and there, right? And this crisscross is what takes forever, right? And I'll talk about a very let's say efficient area where this is happening. So a shipping container from Singapore port to the Kuala Lumpur seaport, the travel time is about 4 hours, right? So a ship arrives there, and the documents and everything else getting cleared at the back end can take up to 7 days. And these, supposedly the most sophisticated shipping areas, right? They take about 7 days, right? So imagine the container is there, is paying demurrage or a rent for being stationed and doing nothing. And if there are perishable goods, so there is a shelf life attached to it. So there are a lot of complications involved, right? Which is not clearly evident. So imagine if all of that can be eliminated by a blockchain system where, everybody has the same version of the ledger, right? You don't have to have your own version by pulling information from here or there, because everybody has the same updated version. And therefore, as soon as something happens, everybody has the same version and same visibility. So you don't need to go and process in terms of inspecting the goods or in terms of releasing the payments, because everything is then system driven, right? Of course, there are use cases where this is possible, and there are other areas where people are exploring the use case, right? But the point that I'm trying to make is, once the system is robust to include all the use cases, this is how it's going to function. Today, there are few areas where it functions like this, but there are others which are striving to be like this. Okay. So it saves time, it saves efficiencies, obviously it saves money as well. Now let's look at a real example. So this is an example of fish caught off the sea of Japan, put it in a refrigerated container and shipped. So what happens is, in transit, the refrigeration unit breaks down. Temperature goes up to 25 degrees, very humid, right? But somebody notices it, fixes the system, and by the time the fish arrive here at the importer's warehouse, where they check the data, everything is fine. It is again minus 40 degrees, right? The salmon is at minus 40. So they take it from the importer's warehouse to the wholesaler, to the retailers, to the restaurants, to the consumer, and the end result is in California, basically in LA. 300 people fall sick on a single evening, right? Consuming salmon, which has obviously come from a specific container. And there is no reliable way for tracking whether the storage conditions were met or what exactly happened. Of course, in this case, the restaurant owners got together and they were able to dig around and get what exactly happened. But other than that, there's no way today to basically ascertain the food that you're picking up from the store is fit for consumption or not, right? Now, with blockchain, what things they're trying to do, obviously, using a lot of elements of AI, IoT, obviously with the cheap sensors coming in, these days. So they have all sorts of sensors here, right, on the net itself, which is capturing right from the time you're catching the fish, right? And then you are putting it here in this container, right? And you have the vessel monitoring system, which is capturing everything. And so right from the fisherman's information, water tank quality, and all of these things, regular photographs, everything is getting stored. Okay. What happens next is, obviously it's again shipped into the containers with all these sensors inside. And if for whatever reason temperature drops, obviously the IoT sensor will give that signal. And if the system is set up, again, the use case where we are trying to develop now in the second phase is that the system is able to decide on its own that now the bypass or the standby system should just start functioning because the system that was set up has actually failed, right? And that can only happen when you have the AI layer on top. So I think I'm going to talk about that shortly. But for let's say for this particular discussion, if we restrict ourselves to the fact that you get the alert and somebody comes in and manually fixes it, and then the product basically follows the same route. Now you have a complete traceability, again doing by the QR code. So what they do is they put edible ink onto these fish, right? And that's how they stamp it, and you can basically do the QR of that right to the end to know, yeah, okay, this is where it was caught and this is what exactly happened with that. So that's the level of sophistication people are trying to reach. And the point that here I was trying to make is, if the temperature drops to a level, rises up to a level, what happens is the shelf life or best before date is decided basis certain storage conditions. So when the storage conditions are not met or they deteriorate, the shelf life should automatically reflect that. So instead of saying 29th of April, now we should say it's only fit for consumption by 27th of April. So how do you do that? The system obviously can, basis data, if you have fed enough data over a period of time, can come up with a suggestion or recommendation that now the shelf life should be reduced by 2 days. And if you have a smart contract in place, you can basically enforce that and you can change the date. Once the date is changed here, and when somebody picks it up here, they can just see the trail, right? So this is, a classic example of how some of these technologies, first of all, are coming together. As I said, all of these sensors, continuously beeping and sending signals, data getting stored on the blockchain. And then obviously, if you have an intelligence engine here, you can basically decide on the shelf life and changes to everything else here, right? Okay. So now this is how the system looks like. So you're gathering data from RFID, IOD, QR, and then it goes to the traceability document repository and parameter repository, gets submitted on the blockchain, and then you have the AI layer on top, and then through a mobile or a web app, you're doing a QR, and then you're able to see the entire journey of the process, right? Okay. Another, I would say, one of the prime use cases is in the payments industry, and payments obviously is the biggest industry globally, right? The size is about $130 trillion at this point, right? Out of that 130 trillion, cross-border is close to about 22 trillion, right? And this 22 trillion, obviously, is 20% of the overall payments industry. And the revenue is obviously 50% of the total payment. So volume is 20%, but the revenue is 50%. So highly profitable business. And they lose about 10% every transaction, every time they're doing cross-border payments, because of a variety of reasons I'll just talk about. Now, within that, there's a smaller segment of remittances, right? Remittances is what, overseas, friend and family people send back to their friend and family, right? So imagine I was working in the UK or US and I'm sending money back to my family for sustenance or whatever. That's remittance. So the market for this remittance is about 689. Again, these are like slightly different numbers. You can always look at the latest ones. Paid about 8 or 9% in terms of transaction fees. Now, this is 96% cash to cash transfer. What this means is most of the time, people are sending this money back home for sustenance, for family, livelihood, for supporting things at their family, right? And out of that, they almost lose 9%. And these are like mostly blue collar workers, outside, right? And so the hit of this 8-9% is very, very significant, right? You see this about 60%. Now, look at the remittance. India obviously is the biggest corridor because, we have a lot of people spread globally and they send money back to the country. So our inward remittance is the highest globally. The average remittance price for us is 3.29 compared to the 9% I was telling you, which is the average. Why it is less? One, because we have the highest number of people who are sending money, and because of that, the people who are in different locations, they're usually concentrated. So you have pockets in the US, UK, Canada, Australia. So some of these are the Middle East, the Gulf countries. And so what has happened is these corridors have become very efficient because there's so much of money inflow and outflow that, I remember my bank account in the UK, if I had to send money here in India, if I time it well, let's say before 2 p.m. or something, local time in the UK, I can actually get the money next day here at 8 a.m. with basically zero transaction cost. Whatever is the conversion exchange rate, that's fine. But other than that, I don't pay anything. So there are certain corridors which are super efficient. But then Sub-Saharan Africa, this is 9%, right? And the ticket size over there is like ridiculously low, right? $200, $300, $500. Like that's the amount people are sending back home on a monthly basis, right? And out of that, 9% is gone. So it's really, really painful. So this market is like really a prime case for disrupting. And obviously people are trying to look at it. So what, again, look at some of these numbers here. I mean, we've taken a $50 cost basis here. The numbers would be different if you increase it, but on an average, you see, a bank would be like taking $5.2 for every $50, but this is 0.27. And the reason why all this happens is, primarily because of the way the system is set up. So today, if you have to send money from the sender in a specific country to a receiver, right? You go to your bank, and then you have to obviously send it to this bank. But of course, this bank will not have a direct relationship with this bank more often than not. And so what they have to do, they have to, through this banking network, they have to go to the central bank. So imagine you are in the US and you are at Standard Chartered or Wells Fargo. So this goes to the Federal Reserve, right, to the central authority there. And through that, they would locate a correspondent bank. A correspondent bank is a network of banks which has relationships with a lot of banks cross-border, right? And so what this has to do is they have to locate this network bank. And through that network bank, they exchange a communication, right? So once you locate a subsequent, corresponding receiving bank, that then goes to the central bank. So if this is India, this will go to RBI. And through RBI, if you are, Union Bank, It comes to the Union Bank and then it comes to you. So what happens is, because the money goes through these many intermediaries, everybody has to take a cut because everybody is doing something, adding certain value to initiate, to enable that transaction, right? And so what happens is, this is how the price starts to bubble. With blockchain, you can basically do this straight away. You don't need any of these guys here. You can basically do it straight, cross-border remittance or any kind of remittance, because you have the system which is trusted. You have the ecosystem which is set up in a way that, you can do direct transfer in a certain time frame, right? So this is one area where a lot of work is going on. Of course, retail is a big area, but also businesses and other aspects are looking at it in a big way. Trade finance, I don't know how many of you know of trade finance. Is there a way for maybe you can just raise your hands or something? I don't know.
I think,
Let
yeah,
me
there would
see.
be limited people who would be knowing about trade finance.
Okay, 2 or 3 people maybe. Okay, I'll just give you a quick overview of what is trade finance. So imagine goods are supposed to be shipped from, let's say, here in India, Mumbai, to Middle Eastern countries, or maybe Iran, or Europe, right? So some of these countries where I am a small time exporter, and there's a buyer on the other end, the importer, right? And they're trying to get this product from me. Now, what are the ways how I can ensure that my product arrives there and he is assured that he will get the product and I am assured that I will get the money, right? Because we are not in the same country, we are not ruled by the same laws, rules, regulations, and you cannot invoke international laws and treaties for all these smaller sort of arrangements. So what happens is something called as trade finance. This has been there for a while, right? So a person who has to basically get the goods in, he would go to the bank and ask for something called as a letter of credit. So they will get a letter of credit opened for a specific person in a specific country. And what that letter of credit does is that if you give it to the person who has shipped you the product and they go to their bank in their country, the bank is duty bound to give them that money which is there on the LC, right? So that is the arrangement. So this is how global commerce is being set up for at least a good 100 odd years. That is how it's been going on, right? This is how it's structured. So the challenge with this arrangement is obviously still there, right? There are still LC frauds are there. Importantly, LCs in different areas have different challenges, right? The way bank document is set up in Korea might be different in India. So every time the document comes here, 4 out of 5 times it will have certain issues, right? And 70% time is going to be rejected. Every rejection takes about 7 to 10 days to create a fresh LC. And the charges for creating a fresh LC is about $250. So medium-sized business has to face all these issues, and smaller size business, I think for them, the banks will not give them the LC document, so they have to rely on their own to get goods from different countries, right? So which means they have to take the risk that, okay, I'm giving you the money upfront. I hope you're going to give me the goods on time, or you're going to give me the goods. And obviously there are frauds because you are trusting. Or the other way around, let me get the goods, then I'm going to give you money, and then I receive the goods and I never pay, right? So all these challenges are there with really smaller businesses, and these smaller businesses are growing because obviously with e-commerce and all these things, these are all smaller businesses which are obviously now able to ship goods globally, right? Which was not the case, let's say 20 years ago. So that challenge is really big now, and that is where blockchain sort of comes in. So coming back to this aspect where trade finance is there. So manual contract creation is the first step, where the export bank has to basically, based on the exporter, create this document. Then goods get delayed because there are multiple inspections and checks by intermediaries, and everybody adds cost. Manual anti-money laundering review happens at the side of the importer. The importer bank does that for the importer. And then there are, because as I said, multiple platforms on both sides, therefore reconciling, having them on the same page, whether the banks or the customs clearance, it's a massive affair. And then because of all this, there are delayed payments, right? So this is how the process looks like. So this is importer exporter, right? So they get into the arrangement, they agree on the contract terms, and then this guy requests the bank, his bank, importing bank, to issue an LC. The issue LC comes here and goes all the way to the bank here, the exporter bank, right? And the exporter bank is then going to advise the exporter about the LC terms, which have come through all these different banks here, right? Once he agrees, he will then send it back to the importer bank, and then the importer bank is going to release the LC documents, basis which now the transaction can happen, right? So it's a fairly complicated, and as I said, it is not straightforward because multiple rejections of the LC, a lot of cost involved before you can clear it. So it's a painful process because of all these guys involved in between, right? So many. Now what happens if everybody's on the same common chain, everybody has the same level of visibility, so people don't have to approve it, people don't need to receive all those physical documents, stamp it, and maintain their ledger, because now everybody has the same version of truth, right? And therefore with a click of a button they can just continue to approve and do other stuff. So this happens something like this, right? All these issues which we talked about now can actually, you can have payment certainty because obviously it's smart, logged in the smart contract. So you will get, there is a delivery assurance, because if you don't get the delivery, then the money is not going to be released. So you are mitigating certain risks. Then now there can be increased financing, because now basis this, you are certain of the system that this is going to work. So your working capital limitations, and also how much you can put in, and banks also know that very well, so they can give you more financing options to have more containers moving around, right? And reduce fraud, of course. And then I think the final use case is on the KYC. So KYC is another big pain. Obviously it's critical, it's important, financial institutions have to do it, of course, telecom and others as well. But on an average, the cost to follow the Basel 3 compliance, right, the Basel 2 compliance, and obviously the new ones are coming in, to a bank can be anywhere between $60 to $500 million annually, depending on the size of the bank, right? And it's a longer process. It takes several weeks. I remember my experience both in the US and UK. I mean, you need to take an appointment, you go there, and you spend almost like in 2 hours, right, to complete everything that they require. And you always have to be ready with the documents. If you're not, then you get another appointment, which can be whatever, it takes very long, right? And after you have done the process, it still takes about 2 weeks, right? So it's a time consuming process, and banks have to do it because they are mandated, and there's a cost associated with all of this, right? And the cost is something here, right? And it is a repetitive process. So if you go for a mortgage, if you go for a credit card, you go for every new product, you have to go through the same process. I mean, so it's again a little bit, crazy from that perspective, that the same financial institution cannot reuse your documents for a different product, right? And so imagine if there was a way for this KYC to be done once on a person, and that person holds the key to the KYC. And every time a new product from the same institution or another institution is required and they want to do a KYC, if they are able to just do a digital signature of a specific request, the next institution actually gets all the information that they are looking for, right? And they don't need to do the KYC. The KYC cost then therefore can be to a larger extent, spread across all these financial institutions, or it can be, for per usage basis they can pay. So there are multiple use cases, multiple areas where people are trying to play with this, right? But this is a very fertile area for disruption, because there's a lot of money which banks can save immediately. Right, so this is some of the things that I talked about, right? Profile is on the blockchain. Client and risk profile is another big area which they are able to sort of overcome. Inherit this thing. New relationships are again put into the document, so people don't have to do it. And then AML here, right? So finally, how does sort of blockchain play into the enterprise space, and why would enterprises be so interested in this? So one, obviously, it reduces time for doing business, detects and reduces fraud, which is a critical area for businesses, enhances their security, improves transparency, though this is not always a desirable outcome. But in a specific use case where it is desirable, that's where they would prefer a blockchain solution. And then I was talking about importers, exporters, all these people coming together and having the same version of truth. This is what blockchain enables, that you are able to bring competing interest or non-divergent interest state parties together, even when they are not able to trust you. But the way the system is set up, the governance is set up, the rules are set up, you can trust the system now, right? You can trust the data. You are able to trust that once you contribute the data is going to be safe and secure. Nobody can read through that data because the way it is set up and stored, it is only the person who has the private key can unlock it. So those are the things which actually usher in a much brighter future for the industry, where people from different competing interests can come together and collaborate. That's where a lot of value unlocking can happen. In terms of general considerations while you're picking up a use case, one is immutability and trust is critical when you're looking at business areas, right? Might not be the case when you're looking so much on the public, but definitely in the business area, and less so on the smart contract functionality or high speed. So as I said, businesses want a level of predictability. So if you can predict that I can give you a speed of 20, 30, 40, or 100 transactions per second, as long as you can say I can guarantee more or less within this performance range is what you're going to get, they're more than happy. They don't want 30,000 transactions per second and then the very next day you're crashing, right? So they want predictability, which is very critical, and most business needs don't have such high transaction requirements, right? And in terms of the business processes, wherever there is multiple parties who are sharing data, right, or multiple parties are updating data, or intermediaries are adding complexity, as I said, we can cut out the layers. There's a requirement for verification of individuals, so identity management becomes critical. And then there are time sensitive interactions. So we talked about food grade products, perishable goods, and other stuff. And then transaction depend on each other. So I update. So within this complex supply chain case, there are so many interdependencies. So if any of these areas you come across in any business case, it's a good area to investigate whether you can use a blockchain based solution, right? And finally, how you assess them, you have to identify project motivation, whether it's a cost reduction, efficiency improvement, what exactly is it that the business is looking for, right? And then establish the benefit in terms of one, the tangible benefits. Importantly, you should always be able to have a ROI dollar value attached. So if you can demonstrate by doing all this is what you're going to save, or this is how you're going to increase in terms of profit, that is something which sells a lot with businesses, right? And then when you're picking up a use case, make sure you're focusing on a very small use case. Don't go for a very big impact use case, because the challenges in terms of getting different competing departments within a business to collaborate with you is very difficult. So the idea is always to have a smaller use case, right? And obviously, you will have a limited breadth. Don't go cross departments like HR, supply chain, finance. Just stick to one, and then obviously get the executive mind. So the landscape is evolving very fast here. Companies will be directly investing in blockchain as a services companies. They will be acquiring startups who are focused in this space. So that is where I see a lot of trend, a lot of discussions, and I see a lot of companies doing that. Facebook does quite often. Key platform support, public and private transactions, which today are dispersed. There are going to be platforms which are going to enable both kind of transactions to happen on their platforms across ledger and cross chain, right? So transaction between Bitcoin and Ethereum will become a reality, which is not the case today. Excuse me. And then this whole idea of public-private, as I was saying, is going to be relegated to history. You will have a common layer, like you have an internet layer today, and you have private organizations and public organizations all sitting and sharing information over the same common layer. That is how this is going to evolve. This is where it is moving, to be honest. And the future is still data, the data that is getting collected through obviously various kind of devices, stored and propagated on blockchain and analyzed using AI. So I think hopefully I've left time for questions.
Yes. I think, thank you, Anurag. That was really an informative session.
Thank you.
I think we have covered a lot of use cases here. So I would just like to take up a few questions that we have received from our participants. So first we'll take up the question that we have in the chat box. So do you think Bitcoin will replace the real currency?
So, I mean, there are a lot of fundamental things that are involved before something of that sort can happen. One is, Bitcoin obviously is a store of value, which means a specific Bitcoin will have, let's say, a specific dollar value. Now, the challenge with the Bitcoin is that the value that it stores has been fluctuating quite a lot, right?
Yeah.
So the challenge with that system is, people who don't understand the financial and the monetary systems would be at a significant disadvantage if businesses or governments were to move to something like Bitcoin. And
Yeah.
so the idea has been over time from Bitcoin, people have been starting to move towards something called the stable coin. And so stable coins are coins which are tethered to fiat currency. So right now we have USDT, US dollar tether, which means the value of this digital currency is basically the same as the value of the US dollar, and it follows the same ups and downs. So that window is very small if you take a fiat. But having said that, I know China is heavily experimenting as we speak to sort of come up with their digital currency, central digital currency, in maybe 4 or 5 months or 6 months. I mean, the work has been going on for the last 2 years, but I think only recently I've heard a lot of noise in terms of it going public. So I don't know the
I've,
answer, to be very honest.
I've also heard that India, RBI is coming up with a current digital currency by the name Lakshmi.
Yeah,
So
I heard about that as well, but that was almost like a year and a half ago, and then I think it was trashed by the RBI, saying no, we are not working on any of such projects. I think there are
but Mhm.
physical issues and a lot of economics that needs to be considered before you are able to. Because I think again the challenge is usually you're backing something against your currency, right? What if you are now doing minting digital currencies? There's nothing to back it, right? So you suddenly enter into a very vacuous space where you have centralized control to continue to mint as much money as you want, right?
Yeah.
Which is what not what you want, right? So it has to be balanced. So I honestly don't know. I think governments will take a very long time, whether Indian
Mhm.
or anywhere else. I mean,
Yeah.
China might be a different story, but I think that's how I see it.
So talking of India, so are you aware of, or do you think there are current scenarios where the Indian government is leveraging blockchain systems in India?
Yes, so IIT Kanpur is working heavily with the Revenue Board of Uttar Pradesh, and then different states are doing that, not just UP, for digitizing all land records and registry, right? So UP government has done a tremendous job in terms of digitizing almost like 80-90% of the records, land records. So what that means is there's like a portal where you go and you click on a person name or a specific dot on the area, and you will come to know who the landowner is and for what particular period, and the entire history is out there, right? And so what they're trying to do now is store all this information on the blockchain so that it is immutable. Nobody can basically tamper and change it. And every
Okay.
time the property is going to change hands, is going to get stored on the blockchain now onward. So that work is going on. And similar work is going on across. I think you should definitely check out Tamil Nadu. They're doing tremendous
Mhm.
work, and likewise Kerala and Telangana. So some of these states which are doing like some phenomenal work in this space.
Okay, so maybe yeah, as you said, property, real estate is one of them. Then maybe in terms of legal records, that is also a huge data that, or maybe area that can be utilized in India for blockchain systems.
Yeah, that is one. And then think of Aadhaar, right? Aadhaar
Yeah.
is, it's a massive database of, like obviously almost
Mhm.
everybody in the country, right? And
Yeah.
there are security issues, right? So
Yeah.
I know government was toying with the idea of, giving people their private keys. And, again, that is what they're trying to understand the mechanism of how they're going to implement and basically store all this information on blockchain so that this control and leakage can go away. But I don't know how long, I mean, how far they are with it, right? But e-governance is a big way. They're thinking of certain areas where they can bring in some transparency. Then obviously, as I said, land records is another big area. Then direct cash transfer. I mean, so just to give you an international example, Syrian refugees in Jordan, camps
Yeah.
there, they basically get paid. They go to a store, and through their iris retina scan, their information is matched against a UN register where their information, because these are dislocated refugees, their information stored on the UN register. And so the retail store is connected to the UN register, and as soon as the iris scan happens, after
Yeah.
you bought stuff and you are at the checkout counter, basis
That's good.
that iris scan, the money is paid because it's a direct cash transfer, right? So
Yeah.
there is
Right.
something which is
Right.
already going on, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there are certain people, participants, maybe you can say entrepreneurs or startups. They want to know how costly it is to set up a blockchain based system or blockchain based business. So I don't know whether they mean to say in terms of capital expenditure or in terms of effort or in terms of time. So
Right.
maybe if you can comment
Maybe
on
I
that.
can address generally
Yeah.
holistically, right? So I think
Yeah.
the biggest challenge in the blockchain space within India, I would say, is the developer community, right? I mean, we had to really struggle to sort of build our team, right? And it's not easy. So finding the right kind of talent can be challenging. And then
Yeah.
in terms of capital expense, unless you are looking to build another blockchain, right? So which means that you're looking to build another Ethereum or another Bitcoin. If you have an idea which you want to basically harness because you see certain aspects of, disintermediation or immutability or trust, some of the salient features of blockchain, if you see they apply to your business case, then building on top of a existing ecosystem, that is not really difficult. I mean, you still have to invest money, you still have to have the right kind of people, but it's not that costly as compared to building like a complete blockchain from scratch, right? So if you were to do that, let's say build a blockchain based system, you think of it as any other .NET based technology or PHP or open source, right? Of course, there's going to be a cost premium because this is a new technology. Very few people know it, so it's going to be expensive, but it's not going to be massively expensive, right? So that is the sort of quantum I want to tell you.
Yeah. So Alok has an interesting question. Maybe I think it's a bit technical. He says how consortium blockchain would handle challenges of public blockchain. Any real world example if you can think of?
Unless the use case, let's say, just to give you a context, right? So government blockchain, so obviously Indian government is looking at blockchain in a big way. I mean, not cryptocurrency, obviously they hate it, which is understandable, but blockchain they absolutely love, and they are obviously trying to experiment in various ways. And so one of the use cases that they're looking at is, as I was talking about, e-governance. So there are certain aspects which are public, right?
Hello, Alok. I think we just lost you. Can you just repeat?
Yeah. So what I was saying is that the information needs in case of a government system are such that there are people who need access to information publicly, but then there is an aspect which needs to be secured and it's only to be seen by government officials. So there is that aspect of public and private within the government ecosystem, right? So, but then they are trying to architect it that the critical, useful information where they need to handshake or pass on the information, that gets transferred through a very secure manner at a certain level. But rest information is in silos, very different. Same approach probably will be there once the consortia sort of take shape in a big way. Obviously, consortia right now are in their nascent stage where people are just trying to onboard. And wherever there is an aspect of public and private, which is what I am seeing in, let's say, Ethereum Enterprise Alliance. So Ethereum obviously is a public blockchain, but they work very closely with Hyperledger because Hyperledger obviously is enterprise, but there are aspects where they might have a public, aspect to it. So there are protocols like Hyperledger Bezu, which is trying to integrate Hyperledger, side of things and Ethereum side of things. So they're trying to bring the two together, and that is going to be the flavor going forward. As I said, these public and private aspects are going to be there. It's not going to be just one blockchain. It's going to be, let's say, an internet of blockchains of sorts. But then there's going to be a
Okay.
common layer, right? That is how it's going to evolve.
Yeah. So do you think there's any way to avoid the miners to check the transactions?
The way information is structured, they can look at the work done by various people to sort of submit a transaction in a block. So for instance, a block will have a certain number of transactions and you have to go and solve the complex puzzle where you get all these transactions into a block and you submit and say, hey, this is the next block as per my calculations, right? And you're doing this almost brute force level of computation where, you're running almost millions of combinations within a time of 10 minutes. So when you're doing that, it's complex because, you have to go through multiple iterations, but checking that is very easy. So what I check is not what's in there. What I check is basically using the hashing algorithm. So if you use it the reverse way, it's very deterministic, right? So every time you run the algorithm, it's always going to give the same outcome. So what happens in this case is, once it's there out for verification for me is very easy. I just apply that reverse and just cross check. So I just cross check that information, not the entire sort of trail from that perspective. But again, if people want to go and look into all the details, as I said, to a larger extent, because Bitcoin is a open network, so people can just go and see that 10 Bitcoin got transferred from this address to that address, or this is moving, that is moving, right? Or who are the two wallet addresses, right? You may not know the person behind the address, but you will still know that certain addresses are basically dealing in certain transactions, right? So that piece cannot be avoided. And if you want to avoid that, or if you have certain other consideration, then you definitely need to look at, a private network or enterprise application.
Yeah. So to be honest, we have certain people who are in their undergrad and maybe doing their masters and are pretty new to blockchain. So they want to understand that how can they learn blockchain. So they know that there are some PG diploma courses that are available, and what are the career opportunities that they can you know pursue after learning blockchain. So what all steps do they need to take to learn blockchain, and how can they achieve their career objectives?
Right. I mean, a couple of tracks in this, and what will be interesting to know is that how many of people would actually want to go into coding, right? Because there are aspects to that, and then there are aspects to actually designing the solution as well. So there are business analyst kind of positions which are out there, and then of
Okay.
course there are core coding positions, like in different
Okay.
technology stacks. And in terms of the core technologies, is still the same: C Sharp, Java, those
Python. Yeah.
Node.js, Python, the basic stuff. You still have to do it, and that is how most of these languages are sort of written and scripted. And again, they are trying to bring in more modularity. So even if you have to pick up a language or two, it's not like super complex new thing. It's more or less related. But what we need to determine, or at least what they need to think, is do they want to get into the coding side of things? Do they want to get into cryptography, which is another area where a lot of work is going on, a lot of core pure fundamental research, and a lot of money also actually is there in the cryptography side of things, where they're looking at a variety of consensus to sort of improve the system. And then obviously on the business side of things, if you wanted to get on the business analyst role, where you look at the requirements from the business side, and you look at the internal technical capabilities and see how you can match it, and what are the limitations, and within those limitations, how you're going to architect a solution, or you're going to look at some different solution. So that is another role, right? So those
Yeah.
are the roles which are basically available, and how you can learn. Obviously, honestly, I think whatever you need to learn is definitely out there on the internet for free and in loads. Challenge obviously is how you get to the right information. So
Yeah.
if that is the case, then you are able to establish what you want to do, like what track you want to go. Like, you want to get into the cryptography, you actually want to get into building stuff like at the back end or middleware, or you want to go into the business side of things. Then you can decide what courses you can take. And of course, as I said, there are online courses as well, Coursera, a few others are there. I can point you out if you let me know what exactly you're looking for. I'm more than happy to have that.
Sure. uh, Anurag, just a few more use cases that our listeners want to know. Maybe if you can discuss, are there any use cases in the farming industry, in biotech industry, in energy sector, and in is there any use case in parking? How can blockchain be used in parking management system?
Right,
So there,
right, right.
yeah. So
Let
there are
me
three to four sectors, I think.
Right, right. People are interested, right? So, farming again, there was a big use case. I mean, I didn't have time to cover here, but again, this is going back to the US use case, where Walmart at one point had a big issue. They had the lettuce, which they got from one of the farms in Texas, and not Texas, actually Arizona, and it was on all the stores of Walmart, and of course beyond Walmart as well. Because this lettuce obviously was taken from the shelf, people made sandwiches, and there it was in the food supply chain, right? and it had the E. coli, bacteria,
Bacteria.
which was
Yeah.
detected, right?
Yeah.
And when it was detected, there was basically no way with these poor guys to do anything other than to basically
Maybe
throw away
destroy it.
everything on the
Yeah.
shelf, and also which was there in the food supply chain. So the quantum of wastage and the money, it was humongous at that point of time, and there was no way again for them to trace. And so what happened eventually was they were able to trace back to a specific farm and a specific lot from a farmer in Arizona, which is where this thing came up. And so then what they did was, right from the time you are putting in the seeds, they're coming up with mechanisms of monitoring it and capturing images right through the time it is grown to it is harvested. And then once it is harvested and packed, throughout the journey, it is there's a QR code and different things which they can sort of monitor. So farming, I think, and especially organic farming, is where I'm seeing this is becoming more and more sort of important use case because of food safety aspects. So Walmart, I was talking about, is already pushing its vendors to get on the blockchain. They are already there. They have tested it out in seafood supply chain, and it seems to work. So they're now pushing people, the farmers, to get onto this. So, and I know India again is a prime use case. So if any of you are looking at farming as a sector, it could be a good one. I think the challenge remains between farmers here, farmers there and farmers here, that, farmer there also might struggle with a public and private key, right, to encrypt and
Yeah.
do stuff.
Mhm.
Here, it's really going to be very difficult. So obviously, people are looking at a cooperative mechanism, right? A union. So people are thinking and experimenting and talking about it. I know people who are very interested, and few of them are looking to build POCs in this area. But it's a problem worth solving, right? I think the problem is there, but how are you going to sort of architect it? What is the business case? How are you going to make sure all the ecosystem partners? So again, I think one thing, based on my experience of running businesses, both here, globally, and now running my company, I think one thing I can tell you is you need to understand what is a pain point very, very clearly, and who's going to benefit from it, right? And if you are able to establish it, then only you look backward and see what technology, right? Don't try to fit it the other way around, that I now have a cool technology, let me find a problem for this, right? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't go very far. So if you're thinking of a problem, then obviously there's a specific technology which is available. Think of blockchain as just a foundational technology, right? Just like AI, IoT, and the rest of it, right? So your solution has to use aspects of all of them to give you that unique advantage.
So I think maybe I also wanted to ask this question. So, and
Yep.
we have a couple of people also asking. So, if you can just tell us about your journey and what are you currently building in blockchain. So that would be really inspiring for people, because I know that it's been quite a long time for you that you have been in blockchain industry. So
Right, right.
maybe since it's nascent stages, so it would be really good for us to hear from you.
Sure, sure. So yeah, this whole thing started about 7 years ago, 2013. Right after Roorkee, I first, and from the chemical side of things, went to a company called BASF. I don't know if
Yes,
they
yes,
still
yeah,
come to recruit here or not. But
yep.
back then they came, and I was the one they picked me up, and so I was there for about 2.5, 3 years, primarily on technical sales. So day one itself, I was not into hardcore technical, so it was a semi-technical role where also the commercial aspects were involved. And then I moved to 3M, where I spend a significant time, different roles, increasing responsibilities, obviously sales and marketing and all of that. And then I joined a company called Scapa, which was one of the competitors of 3M. I was their national head, and then head for the region: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and Middle East. And then eventually I went to the headquarters and had the global responsibility of global marketing, product management, and technical services. So I was there for almost 3 odd years. And of course, in between, went to Stanford, did the masters there, the business school. And this company was started in 2013, primarily on the enterprise applications development side. And 2016 is when we basically got into blockchain, because we were getting intrigued, and importantly, there were a lot of people who were asking us about it, to if we can do stuff in that. And so we put together a team. And as I said, the journey in terms of putting the team was probably a very difficult journey because you try to get people and people don't know because it's just so new, right? But then we went back to the basics. We decided to hire people who had core technology background of several years, and then basically train them on distributed networks and cryptography for 6 months, under different projects before giving them full-blown projects. So that is how it sort of started into the blockchain space. In 2017, early 18 is when we started getting pulled into a lot of blockchain, AI, IoT sort of projects. So we worked on that. We've been doing that since then. In terms of things that we are doing now, we are building a complex logistics platform for a client in the US. They're looking at the traceability of documents. So this is not cross-country or not she shipment or air shipment. This is basically inland transport, right? Using trailers, trucks, and all of that. And there again, the challenges with document visibility, payment. So similar issues as in the shipping industry. So that's a big one. And then we are working with the World Bank to sort of create a POC where they're looking at the loans they disperse to different countries and track the last dollar, right? The challenge is they give these money to all these to all these NGOs and different parties, and they are supposed to then disperse it. And the challenge in this is there's a lot of leakages for various reasons, not that people are dishonest, but it's just that is how it is structured. And so out of $10, basically maybe $2 or $1 is only what gets to the actual recipient, right? So we're working on that at this point. And then obviously there are multiple other, we are working with the law agency in New York, trying to develop an app where people can take photographs of an incident, and then it just goes and gets stored on the blockchain. And then you are able to secure that information out there, and people can use that for insurance or a variety of purposes. I was talking about the biometric application, facial recognition, then it gets stored on blockchain. And then we've built so many applications over these years, right? We built a variety of exchanges, wallets, a lot of things, right? I can share maybe, a small presentation in terms of what we've done. But yeah, things across spectrum, financial services obviously would be bigger, followed by supply chain. And then, we've done work in healthcare, we've done work in identity. So those are like smaller areas we've done work.
We'll be happy to answer your questions. And
Manish, I think I lost you for a bit. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so I think we would like to close the session now. Okay. I think we have asked a lot of questions from you today. So people can always write to us for any questions, suggestions. We'll be happy to answer those queries on our email tides@iitr.ac.in. Thank you to all our participants. It was great hosting the webinar for you. You may follow our social media pages for future updates and attending such sessions in the future. So thank you, Anurag, and thank you to all the participants.